You would think that Jeff Bezos, after making his soon-to-be ex-wife, Mackenzie, the richest woman in the world, would stop publishing stupid things in his blog, The Washington Post. Alas, it's not meant to be. Feminism, like termites, once nested in your structure, well, it's better to just burn the whole thing down and start over from scratch. This op-ed was published last week titled, Why the Patriarchy is Killing Men, subtitled, Gender Equality Isn't Just Good for Women, It Also Saves Men's Lives, by Liz Plank. Liz Plank, a journalist, is executive producer and host of several digital series at Vox Media. She is the author of the new book, For the Love of Men, A Vision for Mindful Masculinity. Ugh, Vox. But Liz has been at this nonsense for a while. She's a Canuck and graduate of McGill University with a degree in, you guessed it, women's studies because why the fuck not? And she gets paid in leaf bucks to put out things like this. How to Be a Man. A Woman's Guide. Look at that like-dislike ratio. I love it. Now if a man put out a guide, How to Be a Woman, a Man's Guide, which would not be 9 minutes and 41 seconds, it would be less than 60 seconds. Fuck me, love me, and don't talk to me all the time. Let's get into the article. When I traveled to Iceland in 2018, the World Economic Forum had ranked it number 1 in gender equality for an entire decade. According to the common way of discussing that honor, the country must be a feminist utopia for women. What goes unreported is how great it is for men, too. In fact, Icelandic men enjoy the highest life expectancy in Europe. They live almost as long as women do. No, they don't. They live longer than the women. If the number of years spent on Earth is one of the strongest predictors of well-being, Icelandic men are doing pretty well. Are you ready? Because Liz is about to do what feminists often do, and that is attempt to draw a specious link between a random thing and feminism. Why do Icelanders in general live so long? Well, Liz is going to attribute Icelandic longevity to feminism because what the fuck else would a feminist say? But Icelandic longevity is more likely due to superior Nordic genes, a pescatarian diet, and healthy living and exercise. But the important thing to mention is the World Economic Forum and its definition of gender equality. And this definition was taken from its 2018 report on the Gender Pay Gap Index. Quote, the type of rating scale chosen determines whether the index is rewarding women's empowerment or gender equality. To capture gender equality, 2 possible scales were considered. One was a negative-positive scale capturing the size and direction of the gender gap. This scale penalizes either men's advantage over women or women's advantage over men and gives the highest points to absolute equality. The second choice was a one-sided scale that measures how close women are to reaching parity with men, but does not reward or penalize countries for having a gender gap in the other direction. We find the one-sided scale more appropriate for our purposes, as it does not reward countries for having exceeded the parity benchmark. However, disparities in either direction are recorded in the country profiles. So you see, when men have a greater advantage over women, it's misogyny, and sexism, and literal rape. But when women have an advantage over men, it's gender equality. Back to the article. Is there some unique magic in the Reykjavik air that makes this possible? Not at all. Iceland offers a model that could be widely adopted elsewhere in the world. It helps show that changing men's ideas about what it means to be a man and lifting up women in the process doesn't make men worse off. It has far-reaching benefits to their lives. And what model is that, dear? Not having a standing army? Eating fish? Doing triathlons? I don't know. Let's see if Liz tells us. Back to the article. The health advantages of feminism for men are not evident only in Iceland. In other countries with stronger gender equality, men also tend to fare better. According to research by Norwegian sociologist and men's studies expert Austin Gullvåg Holter, there is a direct correlation between the state of gender equality in a country and male well-being, as measured by factors such as welfare, mental health, fertility, and suicide. Men, and women, in more gender-equal countries in Europe are less likely to get divorced, be depressed, or die as a result of violence. Okay, so what? Seriously, fellas, you have to stop falling for this weak shit. So what Liz is doing here is offering up a correlation without arguing that there is a causal relationship between the so-called gender equality and men's life expectancy. The more likely answer is that feminism, being a luxury belief system, is indicative of a certain level of material prosperity within a society, which translates to higher wealth and therefore longer life expectancy for men, as opposed to saying that Icelandic men are sitting in feminist consciousness-raising groups and self-flagellating over lay male privilege. Oh, and approximately 70% of Icelanders are devout Christians, so maybe some prayer improves health or something like that. Back to the article. These findings undercut one of the favorite facts of men's rights activists, that men die younger than women do. They use this data point to argue that feminism is unwarranted because women already live fuller or at least longer lives. But a world without feminism would exacerbate this problem, not solve it. Feminism is the antidote to shorter male life expectancy. Saying feminism causes men to decline is like saying firefighters cause fire. Well, some firefighters have been known to cause fires. But anyway, it's interesting. Women entered the education system, as teachers mind you, and then boys started to decline in performance relative to girls, at least before a certain age. Women entered the universities as students and, more importantly, as administrators, and we saw the decline of men as both students and graduates. Women entered the workforce and, wouldn't you know it, in every field in which women comprise a significant portion of the field, wage growth is either depressed or stagnated for everyone in the field, including men. Women enter the political sphere and we get ballooning social welfare programs and disastrous prohibition policies. But if the results of feminism aren't enough to tickle your pickle about the hostility of feminists to men, just take feminists at their own good word. Elizabeth Winkler wrote this in the New Republic in 2015. Quote, "On communal, societal, and global levels, gender equality is better for everyone. But on the local level, individuals must lose. Individual men must lose out to individual women. They must lose promotions to women in equal numbers as women lose them to men. They must take part-time work to support their wives' careers as often as women take part-time roles to support their husbands. They must even step out of the workforce entirely to be caregivers when their wives are breadwinners." As Susan Sontag wrote back in 1972, any serious program for liberating women must start from the premise that liberation is not just about equality, it is about power. Women cannot be liberated without reducing the power of men. What gender equality in the workplace really means is the reduction, by half, of men's power in business and political spheres, and its usurpation by women. Sheryl Sandberg is a brilliant marketer, and she has marketed gender equality in part by glossing over this unpleasant detail. Back to the article. Women typically live longer than men because of several biological advantages that make them more resilient and give them more stamina, despite the stereotype that women lack it. But that's only part of the equation. The other component of the life expectancy gap is what scientists literally call man-made diseases. These are cultural. Men are more likely to smoke, abuse alcohol, engage in high-risk behavior, and have accidents at work. A report from the World Health Organization points to 3 reasons men don't live as long: the way men work, their willingness to take risks, and their discomfort with doctors. When they see a doctor, they are less likely to report on the symptoms of disease or illness. When I became a lifeguard, who cares what you did? Look, feminists love doing this thing. They'll utter equality as a magic spell, as an illusion to blind your eyes and the eyes of the people around you. So if you don't go along with whatever silly thing they want to do, the feminists will point at you and scream, "He's against equality! Kill him!" Always keep in mind that they only say the word equality because equality means something to you, not to them. Liz is a good feminist, and like any good feminist, she can't help but diddle herself silly to the idea of women being superior to men. Women have more resilience and stamina than men? Okay then, check the times of the best male marathon runners, the best 1,500-meter swimmers, the best triathletes, and then compare them to their female counterparts. The results may surprise you. Or, not really. Then Liz lets her prohibition slip show because feminists just cannot resist trying to tell other people what to do. You know, the same feminists who are all, "Keep your laws off my body." You know, those assholes. People often wonder what happened to the first wave feminist or why there was a gap in between first and second wave feminism. The answer is prohibition, alcohol prohibition in America, the 18th Amendment. That was a feminist project, and when prohibition failed spectacularly, the feminists rightly lost all of their credibility in America. Alas, if only people didn't forget so quickly what tyrannical pieces of shit that feminists are. Back to the article. If men's rights activists really want to improve men's lives, then they should join feminists in dismantling bygone ideals of masculinity. When researchers controlled for unhealthy behaviors such as smoking or drinking, for instance, they found that men who earned less than their wives for an extended period of time still experienced poorer health outcomes, shorter life expectancy, and increased chances of cardiovascular problems like diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, hypertension, and stroke. Because of the observable increase in men's anxieties in these familial arrangements, researchers believe that these men lose the only sense of connection to their identity as breadwinners. Violating the code of idealized masculinity can be such a point of stress for men that it strains their overall health. So we've gone from Icelandic men are feminists, therefore they live longer without a scintilla of proof, to women are naturally superior to men, so they're going to outlive us anyway, which isn't true because Icelandic men tend to outlive Icelandic women. And now we're at, sure, house husbands live shorter lives than women, but thanks to feminism, they can cope with their inferior state of being. You, good house husband, have something to hold back your tears while your wife gets fucked by the CEO, while your wife works overtime and you keep her dinner warm in the oven. Interestingly, Liz attributes the anxieties of house husbands to lay masculinity, and not the asshole whose every third sentence is probably some variation of, I make more money than you, I got my own, I'm better than you, you're not a real man, so shut up you fucking cuck. You know, his loving wife. And that's why you always have to be better than women. The relationship doesn't work when she's in charge. She's not happy because she really doesn't want to be in charge, and more importantly, you're not happy because she's out of line and abusive. Back to the article. Men's reluctance to care for themselves is especially perturbing when it comes to mental health. Unsurprisingly, the more a man associates with traditional and inflexible ideas about masculinity, the less likely he is to seek counseling. For too many men in America who suffer from mental health issues, it's easier to get a gun than a therapist, especially in rural areas where 80% of counties don't have a single psychiatrist. No wonder suicide rates are rising in rural states with the highest gun ownership rates, and that the vast majority of those deaths are among men. Although women are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide, the suicide rate for men is 4 times higher because men tend to use more violent means when choosing to end their lives, the most effective and violent of which is, of course, a firearm. And the connection between gun ownership and traditional masculinity is hard to deny, especially when we see gun manufacturers like Bushmaster instructing men to get their man card reissued by buying a gun. Well, Liz, I'm glad you admit that firearms are effective at least. But let's be clear here, women don't attempt suicide. They put on a performance. You'll almost never just find a woman dangling by her neck in a closet. She has to call people. She has to cry and write notes and write emails and send text and then cry some more and then swallow 6 Tylenol or some shit and then call the police. When a man is suicidal, he's pretty much past the point of wanting help. He just wants to stop hurting. Of course, women really don't give a fuck about a man's pain, not unless it fits into their narrative of, I fixed you, therefore I own you. Now Liz has no clue as to why any particular man commits suicide. She can sit here and harangue men, oh, Bushmaster told you to do it, but true to form, she doesn't actually give a fuck. Any man who is up to his neck in debt, or can't find a job, or who feels alone in a house full of people who allegedly love him, or just can't adjust to life outside of the sandbox of Afghanistan, that's all just swept into a nice, neat little box, I guess you could call it the new feminist man box, of traditional and inflexible masculinity for our girl Liz. So every man who finally stops the pain train called life, who just jumps off or jumps under the wheels of the train, she doesn't have any work to do. She can just say, the rap made me do it. The masculinity made him do it. Feminism. It's a prepackaged, ready-to-wear luxury belief system of hasty generalizations and easy answers. Back to the article. The mass availability of guns in the United States doesn't simply affect men, it disproportionately impacts boys. Of all the gun deaths between 2012 and 2014, a staggering 82% were boys, many of whom had used guns to kill themselves. The more a man identifies with traditional notions of masculinity, the more vulnerable he is. In fact, research on 2,431 young adults 18 to 19 years old by Daniel Coleman of Fordham University found that men who identified with rigid beliefs that men must provide at any cost, be invulnerable or be self-sufficient, were more likely to have suicidal thoughts and exhibit signs of depression. Coleman concludes that idealizing high traditional masculinity is a risk factor, especially for men who aren't able to fulfill that ideal because of life circumstances such as illness, disability, or the loss of a job. A more flexible understanding of masculinity wouldn't prevent men from becoming unemployed, but it could help them cope with it better. They'd have a wider set of roles they could fall back on, like being a caregiver or contributing to the family outside of the narrow scope of material or financial resources, as if she'd let you do that. Suicide peaks during financial crises. When Hong Kong experienced economic turmoil in the 1990s, the suicide rate of men ages 30 to 59 almost doubled. After 2007, as recessions took over Europe, male suicide rates also spiked. While rates of suicide for both women and men rise in times of economic downturn, the increase tends to be sharper for men. Really? Really? High traditional masculinity. Okay then, what's low traditional masculinity? Word games notwithstanding, where could men possibly be getting these ideas that they must provide at any cost? Could it possibly be from women? You know, the same women who whine that they can't get married for lack of quote-unquote economically attractive men. Where could men possibly get the idea that they have to be invulnerable? I mean, it's not as if women bitch and moan about emotional labor as if that were an actual fucking thing. Or could it be that men's masculinity and attendant anxieties relating from it are based on the natural desire of a man for a woman, and women's own natural processes of sexually selecting for a man who could provide her with the most resources while giving up the fewest of her own resources? Nah, let's just pretend that men are defective women and that women are wonderful. That's just the easier choice, and most importantly, it vindicates or absolves women of any responsibility for anything. Back to the article. But data shows that gender equality may dampen rates of male suicide because women's empowerment may protect men from economic shocks. Well, that's a fucking lie. Again, not enough quote-unquote economically attractive men to go around. If you don't provide for her betterment with material or status or safety, you are useless to her in the long term, and don't you ever fucking forget it. If women are educated and can work, it lessens the financial responsibility that rests on men's shoulders. Research by Holter shows that societies with lower levels of gender equality are the ones with the highest rates of male suicide, and that the gender gap in suicide is smaller in nations with higher gender equality. One study by sociologists Aaron Reeves and David Stuckler found that in countries with high levels of gender equality like Sweden and Austria, the relationship between rising unemployment rates and suicide in men disappeared altogether. That is interesting because it is an oddly specific statement. But let's broaden it a bit. Countries with gender equality, wealthy and westernized, tend to have lower rates of male suicide versus countries with less gender equality. But is it true? Let's take a look at some data from the World Health Organization, as mentioned before, and combine it with some data from the World Economic Forum report from before. Let's pick out the 12 worst countries for so-called gender equality. Chad, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mali, Yemen, Iran, Oman, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, and Pakistan. What does the data show? Oops! Would you look at that? In all but one country, Chad, because, Chad never gives a fuck, but in all but one country, the suicide rate for men is lower than in the gender equal paradises of Austria and Sweden. Oh dear, isn't this awkward? Democratic Republic of Congo, 15 per 100,000. Mali, 13.5 per 100,000. Yemen, 13.4 per 100,000. Iran, 4.9 per 100,000. Oman, 4.8 per 100,000. Iraq, 4.7 per 100,000. Jordan, 4.7 per 100,000. Saudi Arabia, 4.6 per 100,000. Lebanon, 4.2 per 100,000. Syria, 3.8 per 100,000. This is in a war zone, mind you. And Pakistan, 3 per 100,000. As compared to Sweden, clocking in at 15.8 per 100,000, and Austria with 17.5 per 100,000. Oh dear, what happened to the narrative? Now, I'm not saying that men should oppress women for the sake of their own mental health or physical health, but hey, if feminists really do care about men's lives, they'll just put on their burqas and go along with the new Islamic regime. After all, you do care about us so much, don't you? Concluding the article. It turns out that when women do well, men do too. Rationally, no man in America should be afraid of feminism, yet many are. Giving up a small slice of privilege in exchange for a longer and happier life seems like a pretty sweet deal to me. But guys, if you don't believe me, just ask Icelandic men. They have time. 3.8 more years to be exact. And at last we come to it. Oh, Liz, there is no such thing as male privilege. I mean, unless you count as privilege creating a world prosperous enough to maintain a large segment of useless and unproductive women whose sole goal in life is to hurl criticism at better people than them, both men and women. You know, feminists. But it is telling that Liz is obsessed with privilege, or rather power, and the power that she imagines that men have. So she's trying to play the role of the false friend. Oh, power is no good for you men. Better hand it over to us women, or you'll die. Liz, even if I had power, even if little old me had power, I would never give it to you, or any other woman, because women with power are, generally speaking, abusive. Feminists want power without responsibility. Now, feminists routinely blabber about how women don't owe anything to anyone. No duties, no responsibilities, no nothing. So, why would they have any sense of responsibility, much less respect for any prospective subordinates that they would have in the future once they obtain power? To fear feminism is to fear tyranny, and the fear of tyranny is always rational to the free man. Thank you for listening.